Welcome to Community Connections, brought to you by Synapsity, featuring conversations, stories, and interviews with Ottawa's leading changemakers. Enjoy this episode. Welcome in to a brand new episode of Community Connections, this time with your host, Susan Johnston, board member of Synapsity. For this episode of Community Connections, Susan welcomed Sarah B. Gelbard, PhD in Urban Planning from McGill University.
Maybe to get us going, Sarah, I wonder how you would situate yourself and your work in the world. And I think about the research side, but I also think about the practice side. If you were introducing it to someone who didn't know parts of your background, how do you talk about it?
I've come up with the fun and kind of cheeky title of an architect and punk planner, and that is such a great way to start the conversation about how I position myself, because it's taking those two professions of architecture and urban planning, two academic disciplines that are related to them, and kind of disrupting them a little bit, and coming from a space of having my educational background in both of those, but then ways that my personal experiences just as a person in the city, as well as a community advocate and activist, from punk spaces and punk community, as well as family background, as a first or second generation Canadian. My father is an immigrant, my grandparents are immigrants, Jewish immigrants, what it's like to be a religious minority, and kind of all of those identities that, coexist in myself. How do you kind of bring them together in your work? How do those sometimes conflicting positions help to inform, be critical spaces within both directions, and how you can also, in a positive sense, use those together productively and see the opportunities that often put those in conflict, and actually think of them as reinforcing each other.
And what's first sparked your own interest? Like, how did you first find yourself on this path?
Starting in high school, and that kind of, again, like a bit of a conflicting personality, where I was very strong in visual arts and very strong in math, and I think that's always, your guidance counselor / high school teachers see that combination, and then architecture is the profession in everyone's mind that is that rare space that combines those two often distinct skills and passions. And so I was certainly guided in that direction, but also really taken by that opportunity to think of art in a way that has this everyday impact on our lives, that we all live in these spaces that have been designed by architects, and what an immense privilege it would be to help shape the built environment that people's lives kind of play out in.
It's amazing. Now, one of the first things I realized as I started reading your work, and to get ready for this particular conversation, I know that you have written and researched a number of different communities located in different places, and a number in Ottawa and in different parts of Ottawa. And the conversation that we looked at spoke about, did you hear, Mavericks is closing? And so punk refusal of gentrified endings. And one of the first lessons I got is that I had some assumptions about what punk means, and how we could use it as a lens into inclusion. Yet you've talked about the breadth of understandings of punk, and could you perhaps situate us into the divergences that you found there?
It's always such a a terrible question to ask a punk, what is punk? Because the most punk thing to say about what is punk is that there is no definition of punk. And if you're asking, then you're not punk. But yeah, this is one of those tensions where every single article, the reviewer will come back and say, like, can you please define punk? Because we can't have an academic article where the subject is not clearly defined. And it is, I think that pushes back on our sense of how we generally classify identities. And is it an identity? Is it, is it a lifestyle, a hobby? Is it and it comes down to community, right? And self-forming communities, which come out of kind of shared experiences and finding each other in the world. And for me, punk spaces and punk community it's filled with folks from different backgrounds that normally wouldn't be classified under one group identity or one group category. And it often involves some sort of sense of disbelonging in the world, and also some sense of through direct action, through coming together, through just taking space and saying, no, we have a right to this world, and we have a right to community. And that can be expressed in so many different ways, but so many beautiful, creative communities of care, of this sort of ethics that often revolves around anti-oppression, not always fully formed or fully, a perfect expression of that, but coming from a place of recognizing environmental harms that we do, social harms that we do, and fighting against the system, right? Fight the man. That's kind of the kind of rallying starting point, I think.
Walk us through, you talk a fair bit in your writing about revitalization, set in quotes, and some of the perceptions that renewal, that perhaps gentrification can have, and kind of the dichotomy of where revitalization becomes anti-inclusion, and what kinds of things people can watch out for.
So I think, especially in Ottawa, the renewal revitalization story, everyone is familiar with LeBreton Flats, and we all have this sense now of the mistake of urban planning from the mid 20th century of how wrong it was to go into a neighborhood and expropriate everybody's homes, displace everyone, to impose this master plan. And urban planning, definitely through the 1960s and 70s, kind of responds to that and says, oops, maybe that's not the way we should do it. But our profession is to imagine a better future. And when we see how do we deal with parts of the city that we see as blighted and undesirable and not living up to its full potential, and that it comes often from a genuine place of wanting to see better for the city, to see healthier environments, to see greener spaces and beautiful buildings. And so urban planning kind of shifts its narrative, but doesn't shift its kind of mentality that they have control over the space of the city, and that their plans are the thing that will make the city better. And so we see this kind of shift towards thinking about revitalization, which is a less heavy-handed approach, and often through these kind of strategic interventions. If we, heritage restoration of a key building on site, and that the economic value that is brought by that strategic intervention will then lead other business owners in the area to increase, to invest more money in their businesses and their buildings, in the sidewalks in front of them, and that it will help to beautify the neighborhood, that will bring more investment. And it's often framed in an economic revitalization at the same time as a cultural revitalization. So this kind of pairing together of these spaces that we like to imagine, of where people live and play and work, and that making those spaces more culturally vibrant also brings an economic vibrancy. And in some ways, we also need that economic vibrancy to feed back into the loop. And so it creates this relationship between culture and the economics of space. But of course, economics are not the most socially just way of organizing community. And that, by definition, leaves people out, those who can't afford, and those who pose a threat to the business plan of the space. Those who, as the economic value goes up, that puts bigger pressure on those who can no longer afford to be part of that space. So it also reinforces the social and spatial justice disparities and inequities.
Maybe on that note, I wonder if you can talk to me about spatial justice and what can that mean?
We have this kind of growing, it's such a complicated subject that I think spatial justice is the current way of framing these intersecting complications of how we design space, how we use space, and especially how we regulate space, and recognizing that so much of how urban planning and real estate and all of these ways that, from a settler colonial perspective, from a capitalist perspective, we built in all of these systems and structures to regulate space. And through that regulation and through that control, we are by definition setting ourselves up to restrict some people, to restrict some uses, to encourage some uses. And so we've set up this binary of what are desirable interventions in the built environment, who are the desirable people, what are the desirable activities, and that sets up this binary of then there are undesirables, and in order to achieve the most desirable future, we're going to work on restricting and removing and assimilating those who are undesirable so that they fit this future image that we want for our city. As beautiful and utopian as whatever that image might be, the way that we set ourselves up to get there still so strongly relies on those oppressive systems.
And this is where I'm curious. Something you talked about before, Sarah, that I'd been curious about, and I think particularly why your work is so important at this point in time. And what can we learn from I really appreciated your references to the value of quote unquote complicating discussions around gentrification and around revitalization. What are you seeing in your research that helps us to understand why this is so important right now?
I mean, I think I came in, swinging and ready for a fight to kind of smash a lot of cultural projects in the city, recognizing the harm that they do. But at the same time, I think there is a genuine desire, and that it comes often from a good place of wanting to see better for ourselves and for our communities. And so how do we kind of take this real, how do we hold space for both of those things to be true at the same time? That these communities and city planners and all the layers and players who are involved in these decisions and in making these spaces, how do we not undermine their good intentions and the desires that we have to make our spaces more livable, to make us all feel like we're part of that community and we have a sense of connection to the spaces around us, but also hold that the way that we do that is creating and replicating and deepening inequities for a lot of folks, and also that those often, we do speak from our own position, and in your case, it might make your city better, it might make your enjoyment of the city better, but how do you recognize and have empathy and recognize others in the space with you? And if we're really searching for community, that we have to think not just about ourselves and the folks who look like us and the folks that we imagine in space, but our conflicts of wanting to use that space differently.
Maybe this is a point where I'd like to turn to punk storytelling. And I haven't been part of the punk scene, and I'm so curious curious about, you talked about punk stories being among the stories that can help uncover the creative city for who all the city is really being built for. And maybe before we get into what is punk storytelling, you yourself are a punk storyteller. And can you tell us about Ottawa Woke?
So kind of in a weird way, doing a PhD led to me finally learning guitar, and then learning bass, joining a band, and writing my own music. And such a it's such a it's been such a wonderful parallel at the same time that I'm writing this deep academic text, and in some ways 2 songs that I wrote not specifically for my research, but that just kind of in that beautiful creative way that they're the things that are on your mind that feel like they're not getting expressed, and it has to come out, and in some ways comes out so much clearer than hundreds of pages of work as a 2-minute song. And so 2 of those songs, one is Ottawa, the other one is called Not My City. And Ottawa speaks about this, I call it the story of urban planning, the cover song of urban planning, in 3 verses. And it walks us through that urban renewal of the 1960s, 1970s, this sense of, the city is a dangerous place and we need to come in and clean it up and get rid of those things that scare us. And we need to make it more comfortable for ourselves. And then switches into our creative revitalization verse, which is that sense of, oh, no, we don't need to destroy things to build them up. We can actually intervene in this beautiful cultural way of grain-fed, artisanal, all of the keywords you see of businesses opening up that participate in this cultural economic revitalization. And then finally challenges it in the 3rd verse of what about the people who no longer belong, who are displaced, who don't have space in this new revitalized city, and how do communities respond, and what backlash do the communities who try to protect themselves face as they challenge it with city councilors and with the public media, and this kind of sense that they're missing the point and the good opportunities that happen through this. And so how does this kind of sense of inclusion and diversity that gets fed into revitalization efforts, and especially in Canada, we see that, combination that these are creating more inclusive, diverse spaces, but we're not listening to the diverse and marginalized folks who are saying, no, these are displacing us. So it kind of captures all of that in less time than it took me to explain it.
Now, are there, if you were to walk us through some of your favorite punk spaces in Ottawa, past and present, I'd be curious to hear about them, and what about them makes you happy? If happy is the right assumption.
I think it's, I'm still a relative newcomer to the punk scene, but still that's about 10 or 12 years ago when I started connecting with friends and going to shows and exploring this and hearing the stories of past venues. And I have so much love for venues that I have never been to because they closed down long before I joined the punk scene, but they're just spoken with so much love and affection, and love and affection in a way that we don't normally think of it, that we're not talking about how beautiful the space is. And as an architect coming into how people who like the architectural spaces that I love and that I've gained an appreciation from based on how other people have spoken about it, about the beauty of their design, the sense of celestial being coming into the spiritual, and often punk spaces are spoken about almost in the opposite, about how disgusting the bathrooms were and the way that the stairs were uneven and you always fell down the stair coming in, and the uncomfortable positioning of the stage versus the audience, so that you were always kind of somewhat in between, and that the queue for the bathroom somehow people would have to walk across the stage in the middle of a set. So all of these things that described how terrible the design of the space were are actually spoken with such affection and love that it challenged my assumption that good space is well-designed space, and that it is beautiful space, that it is carefully thought about, and that actually what makes the space a space are those memories of community, of what it was like to be in that space together, the ways you navigated conflicts, the personalities you met, and the music that was made. And so there are so many great stories. Bumpers often comes up, which is now the Works Burgers on Bank Street. And just this week, Dollarama opened up in the former Babylon nightclub. Barrymore's is still kind of in this unknown state of what's happening there. And then, this paper that I shared with you speaks about Mavericks, which was one of the main spaces that, as I came into the punk scene and started going to shows, was kind of a regular space, and this kind of sense of what happens as the surrounding lots are purchased and plans for development go in, what pressures that's putting on spaces that nobody wants a punk bar next to their $1 million condo.
Now in this space, like, what do you dream about? If you were no, maybe I'm gonna take a step back and say, Sarah, you're a scholar, you're a researcher, and you're helping us rethink what is planning, what is community, what is inclusion. And we talk about people having different experiences with participation in this kind of process. What kinds of things would you want people to know?
There's so much strength in how communities come together already, how they work to care for each other and to hold each other, and to build community without the resources of a state sponsored top-down planning process. And so there's so much that we can learn, and I speak from my communities of including punk and what I've learned through that, and I love hearing stories from other communities and really see this work as, that is the piece that I can contribute. And I love hearing from Black communities and queer communities, and there are always stories that, while the specifics of them are different in how folks care for each other, how they organize their spaces, how they organize each other, the kind of common bond is that community can come together and do that. And in so many ways, urban planning and formal processes of participation are such an artificial way of controlling that. And it actually, in so many ways, is an obstacle for community to actually realize what it can do for itself.
And when we think about, I'll hold the term organizing very loosely here, but how do we support people in building and in holding and in deepening the community that they value? And I recognize that and there might be a problem too.
But I think that, that we, and this is a question, as I'm working with far more marginalized communities, whether historically or in ways that's ongoing, positioning myself as a white settler, cisgendered woman, how do I not repeat the problem of thinking that I am the solution to the problem and that I can propose the solution to the problem? And it is so much work actually just realizing what my role is. And in some ways, it is the learning to listen to stories, and learning to listen to what folks come to you with, to say, this is what we need, this is what we're doing, this is what and these are the barriers. And I think the barriers are where my responsibility as that white settler comes in, is to say, oh, wait, those are barriers that have been created by nationalism, by settler colonialism, by racism. Those are my responsibility to work through. And if that's, you need someone to sit through and deal with the bureaucracy of working with the city, yeah, rope in your white allies and co-conspirators, and that's our job, is to deal with the systems that give us
That
the
we
space of
created.
privilege.
Yeah. And I think about that there of like, who determines vibrancy and desirability? And I know you've done a lot of thinking about this from the lens of a number of communities, Sarah, within and beyond Ottawa. And I wonder if we could talk you into some storytelling there about where you see vibrancy and desirability that takes us beyond our traditional planning lenses.
I mean, I'm right now in my apartment in Centertown, and Centertown is such an interesting space of outside developers and city planning. And in my work, I go back through city plans for the past 40 years and see how they speak about different spaces in the city. And Ottawa's urban core has the same narrative as so many others, that it's declining, that it was somehow at some time in the past so much better, and that it is declining, and that it is empty, and that it is somehow not living up to its potential. And it's in such contradiction to everyone, all of my friends who live in Centertown, that this is the only place we can picture ourselves living, because it is the most vibrant neighborhood in so many ways, that we have so much diversity, we have so many interesting businesses, and we have so much history in this space, that the vibrancy of Centertown is something that when you live here is taken for granted. And then to have these outside voices tell you that the reason for tearing down your favorite corner pub, or for tearing down the medical offices where you've been going to forever, is because it's not a vibrant neighborhood, and this new intervention will enliven the neighborhood. We have, James Street Pub is just down the street from me, and that's been a site for a good 10-15 years of what's been negotiated for that, starting about 15 years ago, when the developers were proposing to rebrand the entire area around it as South Central. And this is really strange sense of, they're like, oh, there's no neighborhood identity, so we will impose these two key words that are highly problematic. What group came up with South Central, and what references that has to other spaces in other cities, and to promote a private development. And for the past 2 years, it's now been demolished, and James Street Pub is now being, I think it's James House is the name of the development going in there. But for 2 years, as I walked down my street, there was this giant billboard of the evolution of downtown living. And to me, it's the devolution, right? It's the demolition of what has evolved through a more organic, that has a sense of time of how spaces have evolved, not through this heavy-handed design, but through community spaces. And, James Street Pub was not a lovely bar, but it was where so many different groups gathered. And I've had so many great events and, casual drinks with friends, and had the best patio in downtown, or there really isn't that kind of space. And so it was such a luxurious space in that sense, to have an outdoor patio space along Bank Street.
So true. Yeah, no, I'm just taking a moment and digesting it, and and it's where I have to fess it up to our listeners that I live in Centertown too. Like, it's It's a fantastic place. One of the debates that I often hear, I have primary school age children, and I'll hear questions from other parents of, gasp, you send your children to one of the downtown schools. And I'm like, it's phenomenal. The vibrancy of the school, the vibrancy of the community, and the general creativity in the neighborhood is wonderful, and looks like so many different things. It's a great place to be. But enough of the bias there.
I don't think there's anything wrong with loving the neighborhood you're in.
Yeah, no, like 100%. I think I'm probably running out of questions for my first go, Sarah, but I'm curious about, among the things that we haven't talked about, are there places that we should go in our conversation today that you want to make good and sure come up?
I think we're doing it. There's a nice, I think your questions are prompting the things that I wanted to speak to are coming up within that.
That's awesome. Yeah, one of the places that we haven't gone yet, you've written about the history of punk and the shifts in history and quote unquote renewal in the byward market, and where and how they align. I lived in the market for 6 years in my late 20s and early 30s, and I miss it every day. But I'm curious about your experience in thinking about it and writing it, and what about those tensions came up for you?
And so quite similar to Centertown, Lower Town and the Byward Market are also spaces that over the last 40 years in urban plans are represented as declining, and in popular media. And anytime a story about the market comes up, there is some sort of sense of that, people experiencing homelessness and substance use issues and poverty, ways that colors the market, that prevents it from living up to its potential as this tourist destination, and that it's bad for tourism to have homeless people experiencing homelessness on the street. And that the solution is always, how do we sweep them out? How do we create pressure so that that's not the place where they gather, instead of recognizing this space of, you're right, people experiencing homelessness is bad. It is, the diagnosis is correct, but our remedy to it, instead of going to a space of, how do we make sure folks have homes? How do we make sure folks have the services they need? The solutions we always hear in the byward market are usually two. There's either more policing, or there is urban revitalization. And in some ways, this really has prompted me to think about how urban planning itself is a form of policing, how our environmental design is a form of policing. And we do, once you kind of, that clicks for you as you read plans, ways that gets carried into it, ways that mural programs are funded through Crime Prevention Ottawa. I mean, there's a department of public art in Ottawa, and yet our mural projects are funded through crime prevention. And that just sort of speaks to what the priority is, instead of really grounding our public art as spaces of growth and shared community. It's a space of wanting to prevent graffiti, to prevent undesirables from gathering in a space, or to prevent undesirables from expressing themselves in space, and to claiming that space in the same way that a developer has the right to, of claiming space in the city by putting their stamp on it. Everybody has that kind of desire, and we're intervening in that space in that sense. And I think that is, in so many ways, of having a punk experience and a punk grounding in the market, has given me a different experience of the space, and ways that I recognize, how punks might use the market is not desirable. You're right. I don't necessarily want to walk past a group of people smoking on the sidewalk. But that, smoke break in between bands is such a vital part of community in the punk scene, whether you're smoking or not, and being able to spill out and take over part of a street just by your presence, is such a powerful thing. And we need to think about those different ways of expanding space and contracting space, letting people claim space temporarily in ways that is needed for their community, and for to just have a sense of ownership of that space, that it doesn't necessarily need to be these permanent interventions, and they can be sometimes in conflicts with other users. But how do we rethink our sense of property so that it isn't this exclusive claim that belongs to one person? They have ownership, they have the right to control who is there, they have the right to remove people who are not desired there, they have the right to encourage and to buy, and all of those ways that we normally think, especially in kind of urban centers along main streets and entertainment districts. The amount of authority we give to the property owners, it really determines how most of us who aren't the property owners get to use the space, and that has different degrees of impact on how we might be allowed to use it, and even just noticing small ways that it prevents your relatively privileged position in that space, recognizing what that means for those who are further marginalized.
Now, you wrote about your article on that focuses in on Mavericks is at this point close to publication, which means you've been writing about it for some time to go through that process. Where is your research taking you at this point in time, Sarah? What's on your mind?
I've had the amazing opportunity to work with criminalized women and gender diverse folks thinking about housing, and it's so amazing how this kind of personal approach to the city and kind of speaking to my circle and how we've experienced the city and spatial justice to then work with folks whose lack of housing, whose the ways that so many different systems come together to disadvantage them in being able to access the most basic of human rights of housing. And also just such amazing stories of how they come together to support each other. And so that's work that's going to be the next couple of years as I move into a postdoc, of thinking about housing from those who are in deepest housing need, and who in many ways that housing need, while it's an issue we can start to strategize on how to resolve, it really deeply points out all of these oppressive systems that come together in their experiences and that shape those experiences. And so it does really make us think about how to solve the housing crisis. We really deeply need to address settler colonialism and racial capitalism and cis heteropatriarchy. Like those three together intervene and intersect in the most dehumanizing ways for so many people, so many of our neighbors and community members, that we have to, if we want to intervene in space, if we want to make the city a better space, and live up to our ideal of a city for all, that we really need to think about those systems and how the design of those systems, more than the design of individual buildings or collections of buildings, is really where I think the next place for city building and city caretaking and community caretaking really has to go.
Thank you so very much for your time today, Sarah. I appreciate your work and this conversation, and I look forward to all of what's next for you.
Thanks, Susan. I always love the chance to chat with you.
Something I will Just a minute, I'm going to stop the recording now. But
Thank you for watching Community Connections, brought to you by Synapse. Be sure to follow us on social media and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more content like this. Until next time, stay connected.